James, thanks for joining us today. We thought it would be a good time to have a chat with someone in the real estate and commercial leasing area, because there's a lot happening in commercial leasing at the moment, especially in the major cities like Melbourne. So perhaps could you start with speaking to us about what you do at JLL and what you've kind of seen lately in the market here in Melbourne?
Sure. Well, thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. So in my role as Joint Head of Office Leasing Victoria, I represent clients in disposing of their assets, whether they be project leasing, development appointments or existing assets. I think it's safe to say that the office leasing market at the moment is a very interesting place.
Yes.
Obviously, what we've had to deal with both internationally and on a national basis over the last 12 months or thereabouts has been unprecedented.
Okay, so James, from what can I understand with JLL, it specialises in a few different segments, but yours in particular, in terms of specialty, is office leasing. Can you perhaps talk us through some major things that have been happening in that market, especially in Melbourne, with COVID just having occurred in the last 12 months and now where we are with COVID?
Sure. I think that the office leasing space, generally speaking at the moment, is a very interesting place. Obviously, with the onset of COVID, a lot of organisations are looking at not only their physical workspace, but also the way their employees actually work within that workplace, or flexible working as well. I think it's safe to say that we're still working our way through what that ideal workplace looks like now, with flexibility being pretty much a component that we understand will be here to stay. But look, I think once you sort of break it down, there's nothing like teamwork or collaboration, and really that is very hard to achieve from people working from a flexible type scenario, whether it be from home or sort of a satellite office, so to speak.
Okay, so would I be right in thinking with those comments that you think there'll be more workplaces with less, fixed offices and more flexible or activity-based workspaces?
Look, I think that sort of organisations and senior management are still working through what that ideal scenario or workplace looks like, and I'm not sure that anyone has come to a firm view on a conclusion to that question. Mm-hmm. I think every organisation is different and every sector is different. So flexible working and working from home will suit certain industry sectors, whereas others not so much. I think with respects to the workplace footprint itself, perhaps we may see a reduction or a rationalisation in that workplace footprint at some level, whether it be sort of 10 or 15%. But with that, now with social distancing mechanisms and regulations, you've got to ask yourself the question, well, okay, if we take 10 or 15% less footprint, then we adjust for a COVID-safe environment. What does that actually look like?
Sure. Yes, that's interesting. I can only really speak about it from FCW Lawyers' perspective, but even our view of what our office is very different. We now just call it an engagement space. So we have at the moment a permanent flexible working policy where our employees choose what days and how many hours they would like to be in the office. But what we've always said is, look, if you would like to work from home or just remotely, that's your workspace. But when you come into the office, it's an engagement space. So please find an opportunity to collaborate with, whether it's your work, your actual team or others, but come to work and see it only as an engagement space. So I think that's not too different from what you're saying. I think perhaps moving forward, people have to be flexible with what they now view as the office.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that the way that the workplace has been moving over the last sort of, call it 3 to 5 years or even decade, has been to more of a flexible type working environment where presenteeism is less important as opposed to process and actually output. So for example, again, sort of each industry sector or specific organisation, depending on what their output or their actual function is, flexible working arrangements can work for those or some of those organisations, and less so for others.
Okay, thank you. So perhaps if I move on to another question that I had in mind. So what do you think in respect of commercial leasing from a landlord's perspective now? Would I be right in saying that there's probably more vacancies now with office spaces? And as a result, how has that changed, say, landlords' behaviours? Are they now looking to offer things like more incentives or offering other things to, get longer term leases, or tenants really, especially knowing, for example, that likely the physical footprint for tenants wanting office space may be less now, or at least different?
Sure. Well, there's a number of moving parts in our market at the moment, and I think that we're still sort of in call it a transitional type mode. Naturally, 2020 was a fairly flat year, and that was because every organisation, every business and every landlord was sort of dealing with what was immediately in front of them, dealing with COVID-19. As we're starting to now move into 2021, the vaccines have been approved, they're starting to be rolled out. We're anticipating that the second half of this year will be certainly busier than the first half. And through that, organisations and companies will get a better understanding of their workplace, what it will look like moving forward, and how they can best utilise that space itself. I think when you look towards sort of the landlord environment, certainly I think that flexibility with customers looking for office space will be key, and that's flexibility within the lease, but also the workplace itself. So that ability to, sort of expand up or contract at a moment's notice, but also probably, I think in the immediate term, we're going to see a demand for shorter leases, sort of around the 5 to 7 year type term, as opposed to say 7 to 10. And again, that just sort of dovetails into that I suppose uncertainty in the immediate to medium term future.
And I think that makes sense from, say, a behavioural perspective, because most of 2020 for everyone, whether you were a business owner or not, there was just a lot of uncertainties. So I think you're right in describing where we are now as a transitional period. And during a transitional period, people are looking where they can to provide certainty or access certainty, and I think that's a good way to see it, rather than seeing, all landlords having the expectations, signing up to, if 7 to 10 years was your norm, just moving that back. But that's their way of providing certainty for themselves and satisfying that certainty that tenants are after. I suppose on that as well, you probably more so than me, in the media at the moment, there's been a lot of talk about how, will the Melbourne CBD ever get back to what it is? What is the COVID normal for the CBD, especially for workplaces who can have employees work either 100% remotely, or giving just employees the option, do you want to do 2 days in the office every week? And some people are saying, those media reports, they tend to be a bit negative, saying the CBD will never get back to what it was if we're looking at it from an office work perspective. And that obviously then has impacted other businesses that rely on this flow of traffic with people like your cafes and other retail businesses. What do you say about those media reports? What's your view about, will Melbourne ever get back to that?
Sure. I think, look, with respects to will Melbourne ever get back to sort of where we were sort of 12, 14 months ago, it's not a question of if but when.
Okay.
Melbourne is such an exciting city. It's an international city. It's got so much to offer, not only from a commercial perspective, but a people and culture perspective as well. And I think it's really important to note that Melbourne probably went through one of the harshest lockdown environments, not only on a national basis, but also a global basis. So we can't sort of underestimate sort of, what happened in 2020 and how people are starting to sort of slowly come out of that circumstance that we were all dealing with. I think that Melbourne on a national basis is probably, sort of call it 3 months behind where Brisbane and Sydney probably are right now. And that's a result of, what we went through last year. but also just the fact that, we've been into a snap lockdown already this year. I think everyone was bounding, ready to get back into the workplace with a really positive outlook following Christmas, and then all of a sudden we went into 5 days snap lockdown again, which sort of took the wind out of some people's sails. I think if you look at all of the fundamentals that drive Melbourne, but also the Melbourne economy pre-COVID, pretty much all of those fundamentals we're anticipating will return, certainly if not this year, but certainly in 2022.
Okay.
I think Melbourne as a city has great appeal for, sort of international migration. Now that's not going to happen sort of in the immediate term, but certainly once things start to lift over the next couple of years, we're anticipating that, we'll bounce back out of this extremely well, and probably even start to become an international destination of choice, just simply because Australia's isolated from the rest of the world. We can lock our borders down quickly. We've almost got to a point of eradication, whereas you look at what's going on in other parts of the world, whether it be the UK, US, Asia, we've dealt with this crisis pretty well.
I think what you say there is very true, which is that would Melbourne or Australia in general become a preferred destination? Because if people look back at how Australia dealt with COVID, and especially in Victoria, the pretty harsh lockdowns, perhaps people do see value in that and say, well, if I'm allowed to travel again, I may choose a country like Australia, because look how they dealt with COVID and look where they are now with COVID, and we didn't necessarily have the significant second or third wave, whatever the terminology is, that people are describing what's happening in the US and Europe and the UK. You mentioned just before, James, that Victoria seems to be different in the sense of us recovering because of the harsh lockdowns, and Melbourne in particular, Metro Melbourne, suffered the hardest lockdowns. So you mentioned Brisbane as well. So do you think it's probably business as usual in the other capital cities like Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, knowing that, again, they had a very different experience with COVID?
Look, I think certainly they're bouncing back a lot quicker than we have in Melbourne, and that's probably a result of, I suppose, how their respective state governments dealt with COVID. Being a displaced Queenslander, we went home at Christmas time for 4 weeks, and it really was buzzing up there until they went into a snap 3-day lockdown. Certainly the rest of the states and territories around the country probably appear to be about 2 or 3 months ahead of Melbourne, and I think that's a direct result of sort of what we all went through last year.
JLL is an international organisation, and you have offices in many major countries and cities in the world. So again, knowing that Melbourne now, really the best way to describe it is, in the recovery phase when we speak about COVID-19, are there any key learnings from the experience your colleagues in other countries or cities have experienced that you think you could share with us?
An alternative way of looking at that question is, we quite often get asked from our international colleagues how we're sort of dealing with COVID, because I think Australia on a global stage has been a bit of a shining light. We're almost at the point of eradication, and now with the vaccines being rolled out, hopefully sort of the second half of this year, business should be getting back to normal. But to answer your question, every country, sort of globally is dealing with COVID-19, and with that comes specific complexities in each country, depending on how the governments decide to deal with it. So, look, it's interesting to sort of see what's going on in our Asian offices, our offices in the UK as well as the US. But look, I think it's probably more, sort of a question of how we've had to deal with it. And how we have dealt with it, and sort of what the outcome of that will be, sort of this year and next year.
Okay, so in other words, maybe people are looking at us.
I think so, absolutely.
One last question. I think when if I look back at the work I had been doing during COVID when it comes to commercial leasing. A lot of it was assisting clients, whether they were landlords or tenants, just to navigate the rent relief laws. And really, as you would know, it was just really a commercial negotiation. Yes, the law provided a really basic and general framework, but it was just a negotiation. Are you able to share with us the percentage of your clients who were successful in negotiating rent relief for tenants?
In the greater majority of cases, landlords look at their customers as long-term partners. And look, it's safe to say that in the majority of all cases, that partnership really sort of came to the fore through COVID-19 in almost all circumstances where landlord and existing customer came to an agreement around what they were equally going through, but how sort of was best dealt with from that partnership of landlord to customer. So to answer your question, in almost all circumstances, an agreement was made between landlord and customer.
I like that, James, you use the word partnership to describe a landlord and tenant relationship, because when I reflect on that, I realise that the ones where we were able to negotiate and agree on something that at the same time supported the tenant, but it wasn't just only favouring the tenant, they were successful when the two parties did view their relationship as more of a partnership, rather than others which weren't as successful, where the negotiation started with the landlord saying, well, I'm only looking after my interests, and the tenants trying to look after their interests, and of course they don't align. So I think that's a good way to describe it. So I think that's probably all of our questions for today. James, thank you for spending the time with us to speak about your views about where office leasing is in Melbourne in particular. So hopefully what I was thinking is maybe we'll catch up again in about 12 months. And I think the conversation hopefully is very different, and we may be sitting here and agreeing that Melbourne is pretty much back to what it was.